ROQUAN Smith has always been treated as one of the pillars of the Ravens defense. But what if I told you that 2026 might be the most important season of his career in Baltimore? The criticism is increasing. The contract has become a topic inside the organization, and there are signs the Ravens may already be starting to think about the future of the position. The question is, can ROQUAN still prove he deserves to keep being the leader of this defense? Because the more you look at the situation, the more it feels like something much bigger is at stake. There's a very interesting situation happening with ROQUAN Smith right now. Because when you look at his name, we are still talking about one of the leaders of the Ravens defense, a player extremely respected inside the locker room, and someone who carries a huge responsibility every time he steps on the field. But there's a difference between what a player represented in the past and what he is delivering now, and that is exactly where the discussion begins. Over the last 2 years, ROQUAN's performance has raised more and more questions. Not because he has become a bad player, far from it. The problem is that the impact that justified an elite contract simply has not shown up with the same frequency. When the Ravens invest $20 million per season in a linebacker, the expectation is to see a player capable of dominating games, creating negative plays, changing the direction of opposing drives, and serving as the absolute reference of the defense. And being very honest, I find it hard to look at the last seasons and say he has been at that level. What calls my attention the most is how the franchise is handling the situation. Baltimore could have restructured his contract, could have pushed money forward and created more cap space, something teams constantly do when they believe a player is part of their long-term plans. But they decided not to do it. To me, that decision speaks louder than any interview. It is almost as if the Ravens are saying, show again who you're on the field, then we talk about the future. And there is a detail that makes this season even more important. The environment around him looks much better than in 2025. The defensive coaching staff has changed. The defensive group looks more prepared, and several of the excuses used to explain the drop in performance will simply not be there anymore. Now the pressure is completely on ROQUAN Smith. Baltimore needs him to go back to being that player who sets the tone of the defense from the first snap. But when we start analyzing exactly where his performance dropped, the doubts become even bigger. One thing that really stands out to me when talking about ROQUAN Smith is that the discussion is no longer just about numbers. Because if you quickly look at the stat sheet, you will still find tackles, you will still see involvement in plays, and you will still see a player who remains a full-time starter. But anyone who follows the Ravens closely knows there is a huge difference between showing up in stats and actually impacting the game. The big problem is that several of the traits that made ROQUAN one of the most respected linebackers in the NFL seem to have lost strength. His ability to attack the line of scrimmage, close gaps quickly, and turn ordinary plays into tackles for loss does not show up with the same frequency anymore. In addition, his coverage has started to receive increasing criticism, especially against running backs coming out of the backfield. In a league where offenses constantly try to create mismatches against linebackers, this becomes a huge problem. And when you start analyzing the financial investment involved, the pressure increases even more. We are talking about a player making star money, and when an athlete occupies that space on the salary cap, he needs to produce plays that change games. He needs to generate sacks, turnovers, tackles for loss, or at least dominate his assigned area. I believe this is the main reason the conversation around him has changed so much in recent months. It is not about being good or bad. It is about cost versus impact. What is most interesting is that ROQUAN himself seemed to understand this. During minicamp, he took more responsibility for what happened last season than he had done before. This shows he recognizes the issues. The question now is turning that recognition into production on the field. Because the performance continues below expectations, the discussion stops being just about a disappointing season and becomes about the future of the entire position in Baltimore. And that is exactly where younger names start to come into the radar. When you look at the Ravens linebacker group, there is a reality that maybe is not getting enough attention. If ROQUAN Smith cannot return to his best level, Baltimore does not really have an obvious solution waiting on the bench. And that makes the situation even more delicate because the defense is still extremely dependent on what he delivers every week. That is why Teddy Buchanan becomes such an interesting name to watch this season. A lot of people may not even be talking about him yet, but his rookie season drew internal attention. Before the injury that ended his year, he showed much more potential than most expected. He did not look like just another special teams player trying to survive on the roster. On the contrary, at several moments, he showed signs that he could develop into a meaningful defensive piece. The challenge now will be seeing how he returns after surgery. Recoveries are never simple, especially for young players still trying to earn space in the rotation. But there is a very real opportunity here. If Buchanan comes back healthy and continues to develop, he could end up taking a much bigger role than originally expected by the Ravens. And I really think this is one of those situations that can change quickly over the course of the season. Because if ROQUAN continues to struggle and Buchanan shows growth, the conversation will naturally start to grow inside the organization. No one is talking about an immediate replacement, but the Ravens need to start thinking about the future of the position. And while Buchanan tries to establish himself as a legitimate alternative, there's another player who might be entering the most important moment of his entire career in Baltimore. Few players enter 2026 with as much pressure as Trenton Simpson. And honestly, I think many people do not realize the size of the situation he is in. When the Ravens drafted him, there was huge expectation about his athletic potential. He was seen as an explosive, versatile player capable of becoming an important piece of the defense in the future. But so far, that leap simply has not happened. At times, we have seen flashes, but never consistently. Part of this is also related to how he has been used. Simpson seems much more comfortable playing with freedom, attacking space, and using his athleticism, rather than playing more traditional linebacker responsibilities. Maybe that is why there is an expectation that the new coaching staff will find a better way to use his traits. One possibility is increasing his role as a situational pass rusher. That might be where he has the most immediate impact potential. The Ravens know they cannot simply give up on a player with that kind of talent without trying to extract everything he can offer. Because the reality is simple. This is a decisive year for Simpson. If he finally meets expectations, he can secure his spot and even open the door for a meaningful contract in the future. But if he remains stagnant, Baltimore will likely start looking for solutions elsewhere. And when we analyze ROQUAN, Smith, and Simpson at the same time, it becomes impossible not to think the Ravens may be heading toward a much larger change at this position.
If you're enjoying this breakdown, smash that like button to help the purple flock grow.
The more I analyze the situation, the more I feel the Ravens are treating 2026 as a last opportunity for some veteran pieces to prove they are still part of the franchise's future. And ROQUAN Smith fits perfectly into that category. Not because the team wants to move on immediately, but because the NFL's financial reality eventually reaches everyone. The organization already has important decisions involving several expensive roster names. Players like Marlon Humphrey, Ronnie Stanley, and Derrick Henry are also in stages of their careers where the Ravens must balance production, age, and financial impact. At some point, roster restructuring becomes unavoidable, and the linebacker position could enter that conversation sooner than many expect. That is why the projected 2027 scenario draws so much attention. There's a real possibility Baltimore enters a draft looking for a new starting middle linebacker in the early rounds. Not necessarily because ROQUAN will be gone, but because the Ravens always like to get ahead of problems. Historically, the franchise prefers finding the next starter before the need becomes urgent. And if there is one conclusion I take from all of this analysis, it is that 2026 is much more important than it looks at first glance. We are not just talking about one player's performance. We are talking about the future of an entire position within the Ravens defense. ROQUAN Smith has a chance to completely change his narrative and prove he still deserves to be the centerpiece of this project. But if that does not happen, the decisions Baltimore makes over the next 12 months could reshape this unit far more than most fans are expecting. ROQUAN Smith enters 2026 in a decisive point within the Ravens. He is still seen as one of the leaders of the defense, but now everything comes with much higher pressure because expectations have never been the same since he signed an elite contract. And when you are at that level, there is no room for an okay season. You either dominate or doubts start to grow. What makes this even heavier is the environment around him. Baltimore is already starting to look more closely at the future of the position, while other names are trying to earn space and show their value. That does not mean he has already lost his role, but it does mean the margin for error is shrinking. And now I want to know your opinion. Is ROQUAN Smith still the leader this Ravens defense needs? Or is this really his last big chance to prove he belongs at the center of everything in Baltimore?
And if you're a true Ravens fan and love keeping up with everything happening around the team, don't leave this video without sharing it with a friend who's just as passionate. They're definitely going to enjoy this. See those videos on your screen right now? I picked the first one especially for you, and the other is recommended by YouTube. Go check them out, and I'll see you in the next video.